47 dead peach trees. That is what one woman refused to cut down for 6 years while every farmer, extension agent, and neighbor in Millhaven County told her she was wasting the most productive soil on her property. And the only reason those trees were still standing by the winter of 1997 was that Clara Dent had stopped listening to what Millhaven County thought was reasonable sometime around the third year of being told the same thing over and over again. When the historic freeze rolled through in January of 1997, dropping temperatures to the lowest recorded in that part of Texas in 41 years, and wiping out more than 60% of the region's commercial vegetable and citrus acreage in a single night, the crops surrounding those 47 dead peach trees were the only ones in Millhaven County to come through without significant loss. The man who had spent 6 years filing paperwork to have them declared an agricultural nuisance and removed at Clara Dent's expense was the same man who sat at an emergency crop insurance meeting in February watching a regional meteorologist explain that the dead orchard had been functioning as a frost barrier the entire time, using language that drew directly from a survey the man himself had commissioned in 1993 to prove the trees had no value. Boyd Merritt had run the Millhaven County Farm Bureau and Extension Cooperative for 18 years, administered the county's crop insurance assessment program, and sat on the Regional Agricultural Land Use Committee that decided which land use designations landowners in the county were required to comply with. He had spent the better part of 6 years treating Clara Dent's refusal to clear her dead orchard as a kind of agricultural stubbornness that the county had both the right and the obligation to correct, and he had never once, in 6 years of filing notices and attending hearings and commissioning surveys, asked the one question that a meteorologist from the state university asked in 30 seconds the first time she walked the property. None of that had happened, yet on the dry October afternoon in 1991, when the last of Clara's peach trees finally gave up to a slow blight that had been working through the orchard for 3 seasons, and she stood at the edge of 47 dead trunks with a neighbor who was already pricing chainsaw rental in his head, and told him she was going to leave them standing. To understand how 47 dead trees that everyone in Millhaven County agreed were worthless and several people had official paperwork arguing were a hazard ended up being the reason one farm's crops survived a freeze that cost the region $11 million in losses, you have to start with the man who spent 6 years certain he was doing Clara Dent a favor by trying to make her cut them down. Millhaven County had never been a place that rewarded a woman who disagreed with Boyd Merritt's assessment of her own land. And the story of those dead trees became, in the years after the freeze, the kind of thing people repeated at the feed co-op and the extension office not as a joke anymore, but as a reminder of what happens when a community lets one man's certainty substitute for everybody else's curiosity. Millhaven County sat in a stretch of central Texas hill country where the elevation changes and the prevailing winter wind patterns made frost management the single most important variable in commercial vegetable and citrus farming, a detail that experienced growers in the county had spent generations working around through careful site selection and windbreak planting and the kind of accumulated local knowledge that rarely made it into any official extension bulletin but got handed down at kitchen tables and fence lines instead. Boyd Merritt had come to the county not from farming but from agricultural administration, a county extension posting he'd landed in the mid-1970s and never left, building the Farm Bureau Cooperative into a genuine regional institution over nearly 2 decades through a combination of genuine organizational competence and a pronounced tendency to treat his own recommendations as the only recommendations that needed to be made. He administered the county's crop insurance assessment program, which meant that almost every farmer in Millhaven County eventually depended on his office's evaluation of their land and practices to determine what coverage they qualified for and at what rate. He sat on the Agricultural Land Use Committee, which had authority to designate certain land features as agricultural nuisances subject to required removal if they were deemed to pose risks to neighboring operations or to interfere with productive land use in ways the county had a regulatory interest in correcting. He chaired the county's annual extension conference, which determined which farming practices got recommended, which outside specialists got invited to present, and which ideas got treated as serious options versus eccentric outliers not worth the county's time. People in Millhaven County had a particular way of talking about Boyd Merritt that sounded like confidence in his expertise until you listened closely enough to notice that nobody in the room was ever actually disagreeing with him, and hadn't been for longer than most of them could specifically remember. Clara Dent had farmed 62 acres on the county's western ridge for most of her adult life, inheriting the land from her mother who had inherited it from her own father, a citrus and vegetable operation that had survived bad years and good ones by staying modest enough to adapt and staying on a ridge that, for reasons the family had always understood intuitively but never formally explained, seemed to hold warmer air in cold snaps than the lower ground around it. The peach orchard had been her mother's project, a 47-tree block planted in the early 1970s that had produced reliably for 15 years before a slow, creeping blight began working its way through the trees in the late 1980s. By the fall of 1991, despite everything Clara had tried, the last tree had gone fully dead, and she was standing at the edge of 47 black, hollow trunks looking at what Boyd Merritt's office had already sent 2 letters calling an unproductive land use that was taking up space better used for the vegetable beds that the county's extension guidelines recommended for ground of that type and aspect. Her neighbor Gus Tillon, who farmed the flat ground directly below her ridge and had always gotten on well enough with her in the way of people who share a fence line for 20 years without ever quite becoming close friends, told her over that fence that afternoon that clearing the dead trees was the obvious next step and that he'd help her haul the wood off if she wanted. An offer meant as genuine neighborliness and received as such even as Clara declined it. She couldn't quite explain to Gus, that afternoon, why she was declining. She only knew that she was, and that the reason had something to do with the way the air moved on her ridge on cold nights, a thing she had noticed all her life without ever having the language to describe it precisely enough to be worth saying out loud to a man who was already reaching for his chainsaw. Boyd Merritt drove out to the Dent property in the spring of 1992, the first of what would become an annual visit over the following several years, and found Clara in the vegetable beds she had expanded into the cleared ground around the orchard's edges, the dead trees standing in their rows behind her like a fence nobody had gotten around to pulling out yet. "Mrs. Dent," he said, in the tone of a man who had conducted this category of conversation enough times to have a formula for it. "I know you've had a hard few years with the blight, but those trees need to come down this season. The wood is a fire risk, and frankly you're losing production ground every day they're standing there." He quoted a figure at her, an estimate his office had prepared for what the cleared acreage could be expected to generate in additional vegetable production if put into active cultivation, a number that was technically plausible and had been calculated with the kind of precision that sounds authoritative and is very difficult to argue with unless you happen to know the calculation is missing a variable entirely. Clara looked at the dead trees for a moment before she answered him. "They're doing something," she said, which was the most she had ever managed to put into words about why she'd left them. Boyd waited for her to say what they were doing. She didn't have a better answer than that, and Boyd's expression settled into the particular patience of a man who has heard vague gut feelings dressed up as reasons before and has learned to let them exhaust themselves before proceeding to the actual conversation. He filed a formal land use committee notice that fall, citing the trees as an agricultural nuisance under the county's land management code and requiring their removal within the following growing season, the first piece of official paperwork in what became a running administrative standoff between his office and hers that neither of them ever quite won outright. Because Clara was stubborn enough to contest every notice and Boyd was busy enough with his larger cooperative membership that he never quite made the dead orchard the single issue worth of formal enforcement action. He told 2 other extension clients that year, half joking, that the Dent woman's dead peach trees were going to outlast him in that county through sheer obstinacy. And he did not say it as a compliment, but he also did not say it as a man who thought it was going to matter very much in the long run. Gus Tillon was not the kind of man who openly mocked a neighbor's decisions, but he was also not a man who kept his opinions entirely to himself when he thought the situation warranted sharing them. And by the 3rd year of the dead trees still standing, he had mentioned them at enough gatherings and market mornings around the county that Clara was well aware of the general consensus about what she was doing with her land. At the county farm fair in 1993, a woman Clara had known since childhood asked her, with the particular forced casualness of someone who had been put up to the question by others, whether she had thought about what she was going to do with that dead wood once she finally got around to clearing it. phrasing the inquiry as though the clearing were simply a matter of scheduling rather than still an open question. Clara told her she hadn't thought much about it yet, which was true, and went back to her table. She had stopped trying to explain herself to people who had already decided what the explanation was. She did not have any expert to cite, no study she could hand across a fence line, no number she could put on what she suspected the trees were doing. Only the accumulated evidence of her own observation across 3 winters of leaving them standing and continuing to notice that her ridge held warmer air on cold nights than Gus Tillen's flat ground below her did. A gap she had now started actually measuring with a pair of thermometers she kept at each location and recording in a small notebook. She carried in her jacket pocket numbers nobody had asked to see and that she had not yet shown to anyone at all. The notebook filled up slowly, one cold night at a time, through the winters of 1992, 1993, and 1994, and what it showed, in the plain arithmetic of minimum overnight temperatures recorded at 2 points 200 yards apart, was a consistent pattern of her ridge running 1 to 3 degrees warmer than the flat ground below it on the coldest nights. A difference that would have meant almost nothing in most years, and everything in a year cold enough to push temperatures below the critical thresholds for the crops both she and Gus were growing. She did not yet know how to explain why the gap existed. She knew, from 20 years of farming that ridge, that it had always been slightly warmer than the ground below in hard freezes, and she suspected, in the way she suspected most things that she observed without a framework to explain, that the dead trees had something to do with it, that removing them would change something about how the cold air moved on those nights. She had no proof of this, only a notebook full of numbers and a refusal to cut down the trees before she understood what they were doing. It was Gus, in the end, who made the call to the Extension Office in the spring of 1995, less out of any desire to cause Clara trouble than out of the straightforward conviction that somebody with an actual credential ought to come out and settle the question once and for all. Because 3 years of watching her refuse to clear the dead would had started to affect his own opinion of the trees in ways he wasn't comfortable with and wanted an authoritative voice to address. The Extension Office connected him with Dr. Vera Okafor, an agricultural meteorologist at the State University who had been studying cold air drainage patterns and frost microclimate management in central Texas hill country for the better part of a decade, and who had, as it turned out, been looking for a property with exactly this combination of features, a ridge site with a standing dead windbreak directly upslope of active cropland, for a study she had been trying to design for 2 years. Without finding a suitable location, Okafor drove out on a Tuesday morning in April and spent 4 hours on the property before she spoke to Clara at all beyond basic introductions, walking the ridge from end to end, crouching at several points to feel the surface soil, standing at the upslope edge of the dead orchard in the late morning light with her eyes closed for long enough that Clara, watching from a distance, wondered whether she was running calculations or simply listening to the wind. When she finally came and sat on the porch step beside Clara with her clipboard on her knee, she started not with an opinion but with a question. How long have you been keeping temperature records at 2 points? Clara told her 3 winters. Okafor asked to see the notebook. She read it in silence for several minutes, flipping back to the beginning and then forward again slowly. And when she looked up, her expression had the quality of someone who has just confirmed something she had hoped but not quite expected to find. Your dead trees are doing 3 things, she said. First, they're breaking the downslope flow of cold air that would otherwise drain directly onto your crop beds on radiation frost nights, the nights where the temperature drops fast and clear under a still sky. Cold air is heavy. It flows downhill like water, and your orchard is sitting exactly where it can interrupt that flow before it reaches your beds. Second, the standing wood is acting as thermal mass. It absorbs solar radiation all day and releases heat slowly through the night, which raises the ambient temperature in the orchard zone by 1 degree or 2 on the coldest nights. Third, and this is the part that almost nobody thinks about, dead trees create surface roughness that causes turbulent mixing in the air layer directly above the ground, which pulls slightly warmer air down from higher in the atmosphere and mixes it with the cold air pooling near the soil. Take those trees down and you lose all 3 effects at once. Clara asked her, carefully, what the difference of 1 degree or 2 on the coldest night actually meant in practical terms for her crop beds. Okafor told her plainly, In a normal Texas winter, almost nothing. In a year where temperatures dropped within 2 or 3 degrees of the critical damage threshold for her crops, everything. You have been protecting these fields for 6 years, she said, with something that looks like a mistake. In any year that tests the lower edge of what this region can produce, your crops will survive because of those trees, and your neighbor's crops won't. And nobody will understand why, because nobody has been measuring what you've been measuring. Clara did not show Okafor's visit to Boyd Merritt's office, and she did not correct the county's ongoing impression that she was simply a stubborn woman who refused to take reasonable advice about her own land. She let Okafor's survey proceed quietly, officially documented as a research site visit for a university microclimate study with no public announcement, and filed away the written summary Okafor provided her in the same drawer where she kept the Land Use Committee notices from Boyd's office. The notices kept coming, 2 more over the following 2 years, each one a little more formal in tone and a little more specific about the county's authority to pursue enforcement if the trees remained beyond the next growing season, and each one met by Clara with a written response that cited procedural questions about the notice's specificity and asked for additional documentation that Boyd's office had to spend time producing, a slow-motion administrative delay that she had gotten quite good at sustaining without ever quite triggering the formal enforcement action Boyd would have needed to actually compel the clearing. Gus, who had been the one to call the extension office in the first place, came back to her after Okafor's visit looking slightly sheepish and told her he wasn't sure what the university woman had found out there, but that she had seemed a great deal more interested in those dead trees than he had expected, and that perhaps he had been wrong to push her about clearing them. Clara told him she appreciated him saying so, and didn't make him explain himself further. She had enough experience with being right about something nobody else could see yet to know that the moment to press an advantage was when the evidence arrived in public, not when it arrived in a private conversation at a fence line. She kept her notebook. She kept the trees. She watched the weather forecasts with the particular attention of someone who has been waiting for a specific kind of winter for a long time and knows, with increasing certainty, that it is eventually going to come. It was Gus, again, who spotted Boyd's truck parked outside Clara's gate one afternoon in the fall of 1996, a visit Boyd had scheduled without warning on the basis of a renewed complaint he'd received from a neighboring landowner about fire risk from dead-standing timber, and Gus was the one who told Clara about it the next morning at the feed store when she hadn't known Boyd had been there. Boyd had walked the property line and left a notice on her gate citing the county's updated dead timber fire risk ordinance, a newer and slightly stronger piece of regulatory language than anything he'd used before, and this time the notice named a specific compliance date. The trees were to be cleared before the end of the following growing season, with a penalty structure attached that was considerably more specific than his earlier letters had been. Clara read the notice that evening at her kitchen table, pulled out Okafor's survey summary and read that as well, and then pulled out her notebook and looked at the minimum overnight temperature records for the past 5 winters, and then looked out her kitchen window at the dead orchard silhouetted against the November sky, and did not say anything to anyone about any of it for a week. What she did do, the following Monday morning, was call Vera Okafor and ask her, directly, whether she would be willing to present her microclimate findings in a formal setting if it came to that. Okafor said she would, with one condition, that she could also bring the paper she was now finalizing for publication, which incorporated 5 years of data from the Dent property as its central case study, data that showed the dead orchard's thermal effect with enough statistical precision to constitute peer-reviewable scientific evidence rather than simply an expert's field opinion. Clara told her she could bring whatever she needed. She put the phone down and went back to watching the weather, because the forecast she was looking at for the coming winter had numbers in it she had been waiting 6 years to see. The freeze came in the second week of January 1997, a radiative cooling event of the kind that meteorologists in that part of Texas had not seen at that magnitude since 1956, temperatures dropping to 22 degrees Fahrenheit in the valley floor by 3 in the morning on a clear, still night, with almost no wind to mix the air layers above the cold ground. Boyd Merritt's own farm, 30 acres of vegetable beds in a low valley site 2 miles from the Dent property, took the full force of it. So did Gus Tillen's flat ground. So did the majority of commercial acreage in Millhaven County that sat below ridge elevations in the open draining terrain that characterized most of the region. The county's emergency agricultural assessment in the days that followed cataloged losses exceeding 60% of the planted commercial acreage in the county, $11 million in crop damage across a region that had not had a winter like this in living memory. Damage that was so widespread and so evenly distributed across almost every operation in the county that the initial reports coming into the Farm Bureau office looked, to Boyd when he first read them, like a clerical error. Clara Dent's vegetable beds, directly downslope of 47 dead peach trees on the county's western ridge, had experienced a minimum overnight temperature of 26 degrees on that same January night, 4 degrees warmer than the valley floor, 4 degrees above the critical damage threshold for the crops she was growing. Not a single bed had been lost. The emergency crop insurance meeting convened in February, a packed session at the county extension building where Boyd had expected to spend the morning processing claims and hadn't expected to spend any part of it explaining himself, was the first time most of the county's farmers had sat in the same room and heard a meteorologist explain what a frost microclimate was, how cold air drains across sloped terrain on radiative cooling nights, and what a standing thermal mass barrier does to that drainage when it sits at the right point on the upslope. Vera Okafor had the data. She had 5 years of it, with the Dent property's temperature records at its center and a published paper now in press that named the dead orchard specifically as the mechanism of protection. She laid Boyd's own 1993 survey on the table beside her own work, pointed to the paragraph in his survey that had noted the presence of standing dead timber without investigating its microclimatic effects, and told the room that the information needed to understand what those trees were doing had been collectible in 1993 for the cost of 2 thermometers and a season's worth of overnight readings. The room was quiet in a way that rooms in Millhaven County had rarely been quiet when Boyd Merritt was present, the particular silence of 60 people doing private arithmetic about the gap between what they'd been told and what had just happened to their crops. The crop insurance settlement process in the weeks after that meeting was the least comfortable period of Boyd Merritt's tenure running the Farm Bureau Cooperative, mostly because the question of why one property in the county had sustained no losses while every surrounding operation had sustained significant ones was not going away on its own, and the answer that kept coming back from every direction pointed directly to 6 years of official notices his office had sent trying to compel the removal of the thing responsible for the difference. 3 of the county's largest commercial growers, men who had never previously had any particular interest in dead tree ecology, began asking Vera Okafor's department at the state university for site consultations on their own properties, looking for existing features they might have been treating as liabilities that were actually functioning as frost protection. Gus Tillon came to Clara's fence 2 weeks after the freeze, thinner in the face than usual, and considerably quieter than he'd been the last time they'd stood at the same fence discussing the same trees, and told her he owed her an apology that was probably bigger than the one she was going to get, because he had been one of the people who'd originally suggested to Boyd that the formal notice process might be the right approach. Clara told him she didn't hold it against him and meant it. She had enough to think about without cataloging the specific contributions of individual people to a consensus she'd been right to ignore. Boyd Merritt retained his position at the Farm Bureau Cooperative and continued his work as County Extension Director, because organizations rarely remove competent administrators simply for having been wrong about a dead orchard for 6 years, and most of the county still needed him for the things he'd always been good at. What changed was subtler and, in its way, more permanent. Nobody in Millhaven County filed another agricultural nuisance notice about a standing natural feature on someone's land without first asking someone with a relevant credential whether the feature was doing something the notice was going to stop. That was not a formal policy. It was simply what happened in a county that had just paid $11 million to learn the difference between a liability and something it hadn't thought to measure yet. The lesson Millhaven County eventually arrived at, repeated at feed store counters and extension meetings for years after the freeze, was uncomfortable in the specific way that lessons are uncomfortable when they require admitting that a community's confidence in its own consensus was the problem rather than the solution. Boyd Merritt had not been malicious. He had been certain, which is a different kind of dangerous, and the difference between those two things is that certainty can keep filing paperwork for 6 years without ever once stopping to ask whether it is missing a variable. Clara Dent had not been an expert. She had been observant, which turned out to be considerably more useful, And the difference between those two things is that observation keeps a notebook and waits for the winter that makes the numbers matter. The 47 dead peach trees that an official county notice had described as an agricultural nuisance were still standing in the spring of 1997, not because any authority had decided to protect them, and not because anyone had finally convinced Boyd Merritt he was wrong, but because one woman had refused, for 6 years, to let someone else's certainty substitute for her own evidence. Drive past the Dent property on the county road today, and the ridge looks different than it did in 1991 because Clara eventually did replant the orchard, cold hardy varieties better suited to the ridge's particular microclimate. A decision she made with Vera Okafor's guidance 2 years after the freeze, and that now produces a small, but commercially viable crop on exactly the ground Boyd Merritt had spent 6 years trying to return to standard vegetable production. The dead trees that protected those beds through the worst freeze in 41 years are gone now, replaced by something living that does the same work and a great deal more besides, and nobody in the county is suggesting she cut them down. It is worth sitting with how easily the whole thing could have gone the other way. If Boyd's enforcement action had succeeded in 1992 or 1993, before Okafor's survey, before the notebook filled up, before anyone had put scientific language around what was happening on that ridge, those trees would have come down, and the January freeze of 1997 would have taken Clara's crops the same as everyone else's, and nobody would ever have known there was anything to explain. If Gus had never called the extension office out of frustrated curiosity, Okafor might never have found the property, and Clara's evidence would have stayed in a jacket pocket notebook forever, legible only to the person who wrote it. And if Boyd had not filed that fall 1996 notice with its specific compliance deadline, there would have been no formal setting in February to put the data in front of a room full of farmers who needed to understand what had just happened to their crops and why. The thing that was meant to end the story turned out to be the thing that made the story finally make sense to everyone who heard it. If this story landed for you, hit like before you go, because it genuinely helps more people find it. Share it with somebody who's ever been told to remove the thing they refuse to stop believing in. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one landing in your feed every week. And down in the comments, tell us about a time you were right about something nobody else would measure. We read every single one.